Hello. Today's video, we will be talking about WCS, World Coordinate System, and UCS, the User Coordinate System. Um, Basically, what the World Coordinate System is essentially your X and Y, sometimes your Z, when we get into 3D um, drawing, that will come into play. But for right now, when we're talking about two-dimensional drawings, um, we're talking about your X and Y axis, which you can see here at the bottom of my screen. It's your X and Y. And basically, your WCS is never changing. It is always consistent across your drawings and will remain the same. Consider that similar to how north, south, east, and west works, right? The world, if you look at the world, north is always north, south, east, and west is always pointing in the direction that it is pointing. With that said, that doesn't change. However, in AutoCAD, you do have the option of changing the X and Y axis and placing its location in other places and changing its orientation. Once you move your your WCS, for your XY axis, it becomes a user coordinate system, a UCS, because the user is controlling it and it's not controlled by, let's say, the world, right? It's not your standard, unchanging uh, coordinate system. So if, for instance, I get to my UCS here and I select it with my cursor, I can grab the grip right at the intersection point and I can move it to wherever I want it. And once I move it to somewhere else that's other than its world location, it becomes a UCS. And you might have noticed up here that it changed from WCS to unnamed. Um, so if I were to come here and click on just below the view cube and right there where my cursor is, and I change it back to WCS, the X and Y jumps back to its original location. And again, if I select it again, I can move that to wherever I want to. And once I do that, take a look at here, it's going to change from WCS to unnamed because it is a unnamed UCS. Um, we can name this if we wanted to. If we wanted to name it, we can right mouse click on the UCS icon, come to named UCS and click save. And if I give it a name, um, let's just call it UCS1, enter. And now it becomes UCS1. By saving its name, it's very helpful because if I have this UCS now at a location that I want it to, I can always return back to it, just like I could return back to WCS and return the UCS back to its original location. I can come back over here and activate it and have it turn into return back to UCS1 and it brings it back. And that's very helpful for what it is that we're going to use it for, not only in two-dimensional drawings, but also in three-dimensional drawings when we get to that part of it. So that is the UCS. If you notice, when I select that UCS, not only do I have the square grip in the intersection of those two axes that allows me to move it, I can also click on the X or Y axes and I can turn the UCS and flip it into whatever direction I want. So if I want the UCS, the X axis to be vertical in terms of the plane that I'm looking at now, I can just rotate my cursor and it will rotate it so that my X is vertical. I can also drag my cursor the other way so that my X and Y is flipped and my Y is pointing down. The direction of the axes will indicate the positive direction, right? So under normal circumstances, the X is across the bottom and pointing to the right. The Y is pointing up. Those are positive directions. If, for instance, I flip this 180 degrees where the y is pointing down and the x is pointing to the left. Those directions indicate the positive direction. If I wanted to move it the other way, I use negative. So I can rotate my UCS so that those axes are facing any which way that I want to. And right now, if you notice, they're only turning in 90-degree increments because I have ortho set to on. If I turned off ortho, right, either by clicking F8 or coming down here and turning off ortho, I can rotate my UCS in whatever direction I would like. And this will be handy later when we want our UCS to be parallel to a surface or an object that might not be 90, 180, 270, 360, so on and so forth. For instance, this wall here. So if we wanted this UCS to be parallel to that, we can do that as well. And that's simply just moving that UCS to a location on that wall. And I'm going to pick the intersection. And then I could pick the grip. And if I turn off my ortho by pressing F8, or again, down here, turning it off here, I can rotate my UCS so that my x-axis is parallel to that wall. And that will be very handy if I want to, let's say, move something along this wall, draw something that's parallel to this wall, my UCS, and if you notice, my cursor then also rotates so that it is parallel to the UCS. And again, because I've moved this several times, it's returned to an unnamed UCS. I can go back and restore UCS1 if I wanted to, or if I wanted to save this, since I've already created this UCS, I can right mouse click named UCS, and save it as 45-degree wall or something like that, right? And it's always good to name it in such a way that you can remember at a later date. So that is the UCS. If you wanted to return again back to UCS, the world UCS, I can return it back to that as well. Okay, so why would the UCS be handy? We will again talk about that at another video where I'm rotating the UCS around my drawing to help me draw things like elevations, and I will be rotating UCSs to be parallel to 3D objects once we start talking about 3D objects. And that is your UCS. So a couple of other things regarding the UCS that is useful. Again, we talked about selecting it. We talked about rotating it by grabbing each axis and rotating it parallel to one another. We talked about right mouse clicking, naming it. And there's some other options here, some of which we'll talk about at a later date, because they're more about 3D modeling, like the 3-point UCS, making your UCS parallel to certain views or faces or objects. Normally, when you're working in 2 dimensions, some of those don't really apply, right? So that would be the UCS. Something that I would also like to talk about is once we rotate the UCS, how do we actually orient our drawing to be parallel to that specific UCS, right? So for instance, my drawing is, my WCS is oriented as it is now, X across the bottom and Y going vertical. If I take my UCS and I move it, let's say, just over here, just so it's out of the way and I can see it, and I rotate my X-axis so that it is vertical, I could turn on my ortho, drag it straight vertical, click, and it rotates my UCS. But now my UCS is vertical, my X-axis is vertical. Normally we draw with the X-axis across the bottom, pointing to the right, and the Y-axis pointing vertical up. Now it's X pointing up and Y is pointing to the right. And also, if you notice in the view cube, it also rotates that view as well. So a couple of things we can do here, right? If we wanted this drawing to be parallel to the X and Y axis. One, we can go to the view cube. And if you look at the view cube, it's broken up to north, south, east, west, right? And again, below that is where we select our different UCSs that we have saved or returning back to the WCS. You also notice on the upper right corner of that view cube, we have these two arrows right here. And what that allows us to do is actually rotate the views so that we can basically navigate around our plan in 90-degree increments. And clicking on that arrow once, it rotates it 90 degrees and thereby making my view parallel to the current UCS, which puts the x-axis along the bottom pointing to the right and the vertical y-axis pointing up. Okay, so if I were to go back to that arrow again, I can again rotate it again. But if you notice now, the UCS stays where it is. Now, if I want again to have my UCS parallel to my view, I can select my UCS, click on the x-axis and rotate that so that that is parallel again where x is along the bottom, pointing to the right, and the y is vertical, pointing upwards. Okay, but if you also notice in that view cube, north is still at the bottom, right? Because this is tied to the world UCS. North was always pointing towards this side of the plan where this dotted line is. So as I rotate this, those north, south, east, west still orient the same way, but my UCS is not, right? Because the UCS is not, it's user controlled and the WCS never changes, okay? So another way of changing your view so that it is parallel to the UCS is to type the word plan, P-L-A-N. Hit enter, and it will ask you, do you want the plan to be oriented based on the current UCS or the world UCS or some other UCS that you might have created, right? And for this, because I've rotated my UCS and it is also my current UCS, I can select current UCS and it will rotate that automatically so that it is parallel to the current UCS. If I were to change this UCS to the one I created earlier, a 45-degree wall, right? It rotates my UCS 45 degrees so that it's parallel to the wall and that the x-axis is also parallel to that wall. But of course, as you notice, it is also rotated, right? Now I want to have my plan parallel to that UCS. Now, if I go back to these arrows, remember, these arrows will rotate your view to be parallel to the current UCS. So you could use that arrow, or if I undo back the view, I could type plan and I could change it to be parallel to the current UCS and it will rotate my view so that it's parallel. Now, if I wanted to draw something that was perpendicular to this, I can do that. And everything I draw is oriented based on this 45-degree wall as well as the UCS, right? So when I have things set to ortho, it is orthographic. It is ortho 90 degrees to my UCS. So if I were to draw a line now and I turned on ortho, it is parallel to that UCS. If I turn it off, I can again draw it however I want. If I return my UCS to world, which is right there, I can rotate so that I am parallel to that UCS. And again, when I draw something, and if I turn on ortho, F8, it returns everything to be orthographic to that UCS. Okay, so that will be very handy for what it is that we're working on. The next video will talk about rotating your UCS around a plan so that that will aid in our orthographic projections for things like elevations and sections. So take a look at that next video and I will see you soon.